November 8, 1943, Imperial Japanese. Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. Admiral Osami. Nagano, Chief of the Naval General. Staff, reviewed intelligence photographs. Captured from downed American reconnaissance aircraft. The images showed something unprecedented in naval warfare. Massive floating structures in Pearl Harbor that appeared to be mobile. Dry docks, transportable repair. Facilities capable of servicing capital. Ships without permanent shore. Installations. His engineering staff had analyzed the photographs with professional skepticism. Commander Teo Yoshida, a naval architect who had designed facilities at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, delivered the assessment with barely concealed disdain. The Americans are attempting to create floating dry docks, sir. Advanced bases, sectional docks, ABSD units. According to captured documents, they claim these structures can be towed across the Pacific and assembled at forward bases to repair capital ships without returning to Pearl Harbor or the American mainland. No. Studied the photographs more carefully. The structures were enormous, over 800 ft long, capable of lifting vessels, displacing 90,000 tons. They appeared to be sectional, constructed in pieces that could be transported separately and assembled on location. This is fantasy, Nago stated flatly. Dry do. Facilities require massive shore installations, concrete foundations, pumping systems, electrical infrastructure. The Americans are proposing to create temporary facilities in forward areas with none of this supporting structure. It violates basic engineering principles, Yoshida nodded. Agreement. The concept is theoretically possible but practically absurd. A floating dry dock of sufficient size to service fleet carriers would require sections weighing thousands of tons each. Transportation across the Pacific would take months. Assembly and forward areas without shore facilities would be impossible. Even if somehow constructed, the dock would be vulnerable to weather, enemy attack, structural failure. No rational navy would attempt this. The assessment reflected conventional naval wisdom that Japanese doctrine had perfected over decades. Ship repair required permanent facilities. Damaged vessels returned to home ports for repair in established naval arsenals. This was how naval warfare had functioned since the age of sail. The Americans were apparently so desperate after their Pacific losses that they were pursuing engineering fantasies. What Admiral Nagino and his staff could not comprehend was that the Americans were not pursuing fantasy. They were industrializing ship repair with the same mass production philosophy that had transformed aircraft manufacturing, tank production, and every other aspect of American military capability. The floating dry docks represented not desperation, but revolutionary thinking about forward logistics. Within 18 months, these engineering absurdities would repair battle damage to 6 American fleet carriers in mid-ocean, enabling them to return to combat in days rather than months. Within 2 years, Japanese admirals would realize that American floating dry docks had solved the fundamental logistics problem that was strangling Japanese naval operations, the tyranny of distance from repair facilities. The concept of the advanced base sectional dock had emerged from painful American experience in 1942, after the battles of Coral Sea and Midway. Multiple American carriers required significant repair. The U.S. Yorktown had been damaged at Coral Sea, rushed through repairs at Pearl Harbor in 72 hours, then suffered catastrophic damage at Midway before sinking. The USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga sustained battle damage that required months of repair at American shipyards. The strategic problem was obvious and devastating. The Pacific Theater covered millions of square miles. Battle damage that required dock facilities meant vessels had to steam thousands of miles back to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast. This removed carriers from combat operations for months, time the Americans could not afford when they possessed fewer than a dozen fleet carriers against Japanese naval superiority. Traditional naval doctrine offered no solution. Dry dock facilities required years to construct. Massive capital investment and permanent shore installations. Building such facilities on forward Pacific islands was impossible given the engineering requirements and the constant threat of Japanese attack. The American solution was characteristically direct and industrially audacious. If permanent dry docks couldn't be built forward, they would build transportable ones. If conventional engineering said this was impossible, they would engineer new solutions. If other navies considered the concept absurd, they would prove it functional through industrial capability. The advanced base sectional dock design was revolutionary in its simplicity. Rather than constructing a single massive structure, engineers designed modular sections, typically 10 sections per complete dock each, approximately 80 feet long and 240 feet wide. Each section could be built separately, transported on cargo vessels, then assembled on location, using nothing more than tugboats and basic welding equipment. The largest ABSD-1 class docks, when fully assembled, measured 827 feet long and 240 feet wide. They could lift vessels displacing up to 90,000 tons, large enough to handle any American carrier, battleship, or multiple smaller vessels simultaneously. The lifting capacity exceeded most permanent shore facilities. Japanese naval intelligence received reports of these construction efforts in early 1943. The assessment from Tokyo was dismissive. Vice Admiral Takagi Tako, commanding the Naval Technical Department, reviewed the intelligence with professional disdain. The Americans are building dock sections in pieces. They propose to transport these across the Pacific and assemble them at forward bases without shore support infrastructure. The engineering is theoretically sound but practically impossible. Weather conditions will prevent assembly. Structural integrity will fail under combat vessel weight. The Americans are wasting wreaths on concepts that cannot function in actual warfare. This assessment reflected Japanese naval experience with their own forward repair capabilities. Japan had constructed permanent facilities at Truk, Rabaul, and Singapore. Massive investments requiring years of construction and extensive shore support. Even with these facilities, major repairs required. Return to Core Sabo or Yokosuka naval arsenals in Japan proper. The idea that floating structures could replace this infrastructure seemed absurd. The first American advanced base sectional dock, ABSD-1, was completed in sections throughout 1943. In August 1943, the sections were loaded onto cargo vessels and towed across the Pacific to Espiritu Santo in the New Hebre, over 5,000 m from their construction site. Japanese submarines reported sighting the strange cargo, but couldn't understand what they were observing. On September 15, 1943, American engineers began assembling ABSD-1 in Espiritu Santo Harbor. The process took 11 days, far longer than planned, due to weather, but far shorter than Japanese engineers had predicted would be possible. When completed, the dock stretched over 800 feet across the harbor, capable of lifting 90,000 tons. The first vessel to use the facility was the USS Mississippi, a battleship requiring propeller repair after grounding. The repair, which would have required a month-long journey to Pearl Harbor and another month in dry dock, was completed. In 6 days, the battleship returned to combat operations. Japanese intelligence received reports of this accomplishment with disbelief. A floating dock had successfully lifted and repaired a battleship in a forward area without shore facilities. The reports were initially classified as American propaganda or misidentification. Then in November 1943, the USS Saratoga, damaged by a Japanese submarine torpedo that killed the cruiser's propulsion system, limped into Espiritu Santo. The carrier, displacing over 40,000 tons, would normally require a journey to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast for repair. Instead, it entered ABSD-1. Over the following 3 weeks, American engineers replaced damaged propeller Shafts repaired hull plating and overhauled the carrier's propulsion system. The Saratoga departed Espiritus to Sinanto fully operational, having completed repairs in less than a month, rather than the 3 to 4 months that return to American shipyards would have required. Japanese naval intelligence could no longer dismiss the floating dry docks as propaganda. The Americans had solved the forward repair problem that Japanese logistics doctrine considered insoluble. More disturbing, they had done so using transportable facilities that could be moved to follow fleet operations. By early 1944, the strategic implications were becoming clear to Japanese planners. Admiral Minikoga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received comprehensive intelligence on American floating dry dock capabilities. His assessment revealed growing alarm. The enemy has created mobile repair capability that fundamentally alters Pacific naval warfare logistics. Our damaged vessels must return to home islands for repair, removing them from combat for months. American damaged vessels can be repaired at forward bases and returned to combat in weeks. This asymmetry is insupportable. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the full strategic impact of American floating dry docks. During the engagement, known to Americans as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese naval aviation was devastated, losing over 600 aircraft and 3 carriers. But American vessels also sustained damage. The USS Bunker Hill took kamikaze damage that destroyed portions of her flight deck and killed 346 sailors. Under traditional naval logistics, the carrier would have required return to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast for repairs, a round trip of over 6,000 m, taking 2 to 3 months minimum. Instead, the Bunker Hill steamed to Uli Atoll, where ABSD-2 had been assembled in April 1944. The carrier entered the floating dry dock on June 23rd. Over the following 19 days, engineers replaced destroyed flight deck sections, repaired structural damage, overhauled damaged systems, and returned the carrier to fully operational status. The Bunker Hill departed on July 12th and participated in strikes on the Philippines in September. Japanese observers monitoring American naval movements could not comprehend the timeline. A carrier with catastrophic damage had returned to combat in under 2 months, according to Japanese logistics doctrine. Such repairs should have required 4 to 6 months. The Americans had somehow compressed the timeline by February 3rd. The explanation was the floating dry dock at Ulithi, a facility that hadn't existed in January 1944 that had been assembled in a remote Pacific at all in 6 weeks, that was providing repair capability equivalent to permanent shore installations. By late 1944, the Americans had deployed 6 advanced base sectional docks across the Pacific at Espiritu Santo, Manus Island, Uli Lee, and later Guam and Okinawa. Each facility could service multiple vessels simultaneously. Together, they created a forward repair network that Japanese naval logistics could not match. The strategic impact was devastating to Japanese naval operations. The Imperial Japanese Navy, operating from bases in the home islands, and Singapore faced repair timelines measured in months. American vessels, supported by forward floating dry docks, faced repair timelines measured in weeks. In a war of attrition, this difference was decisive. More significantly, the floating dry docks were mobile. When American operations shifted from the Central Pacific to the Philippines, the dry docks followed. ABSD-3 was disassembled at Espiritu Santo, transported 3,000 miles, and reassembled at later Gulf. In just 5 weeks, the Americans had created naval infrastructure that could relocate faster than Japanese forces could adapt their defensive strategies. Japanese attempts to counter American floating dry dock capabilities failed comprehensively. They lacked the industrial capacity to construct similar facilities. They lacked the transportation capability to move such massive structures. They lacked the engineering expertise to assemble complex sectional docks without extensive shore support. Most. Fundamentally, they lacked the conceptual framework to understand that forward repair could be industrialized, rather than requiring permanent installations. Vice Admiral Matt Agaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, recorded in his diary in October 1944, the Americans repair their carriers at forward bases using floating facilities we considered impossible to construct. Our carriers, when damaged, must return to home waters for repair. This asymmetry means American carriers, damaged in battle, return to combat in weeks, while our carriers require months. We cannot sustain this attrition. The Americans have industrialized ship repair the way they industrialized aircraft production. We have no counter to industrial capacity operating at this scale. The statistics validated Agaki's assessment. Between June 1944 and August 1945, American floating dry docks at forward Pacific bases completed major repairs on 6 fleet carriers: Bunker Hill, Intrepid, Franklin, Enterprise, Yorktown, Hornet, 11 escort carriers, 8 battleships, 23 cruisers, 67 destroyers, over 200 auxiliary vessels. The total tonnage serviced exceeded 2 million tons, equivalent to the entire Japanese combined fleet at its peak. More significantly, the average repair time for major battle damage was 32 days, compared to 90 to 120 days for vessels returning to Pearl Harbor or the American West Coast. This compression of repair timelines multiplied American naval combat power. A carrier that could return to combat in 1 month rather than 4 was effectively worth 4 carriers. The 6 major floating dry docks created force multiplication, equivalent to adding 24 fleet carriers to the American Pacific Fleet. Japanese naval strategy had been predicated on achieving favorable exchange ratios in carrier battles. If Japan could sink 2 American carriers for every 1 Japanese carrier lost, attrition would eventually favor Japan because American carriers would be further from repair facilities. The floating dry docks demolished this calculation. American carriers returned from battle damage 3 times faster than Japanese strategic planning had assumed possible. The most devastating example came in March 1945 with the USS Franklin. The carrier suffered the worst battle damage any American carrier survived during the war, hit by 2 500 lb bombs that penetrated to the hangar deck, causing massive fires and explosions that killed 724 crew members. The Franklin was dead in the water, listing 13 degrees with entire sections destroyed. Under any conventional assessment, the Franklin was a total loss. Japanese reconnaissance confirmed the catastrophic damage and classified the carrier as sunk, but the Franklin's crew saved the ship, keeping it afloat through heroic damage control. Tugs towed the devastated carrier across the Pacific to WWII. At ABSD-6, American engineers surveyed the damage and determined the Franklin could be repaired. Over the following 60 days, they replaced destroyed sections of flight deck, rebuilt hangar spaces, overhauled propulsion systems, and returned the carrier to operational status. Though the ship ultimately sailed to the United States for final repairs, the Franklin participated in no further combat, but the fact that it survived at all demonstrated American repair capability that defied Japanese comprehension. Japanese engineers reviewing intelligence reports on the Franklin's survival could not reconcile the damage assessment with the repair timeline. A carrier with that level of destruction should have been scrapped. The Americans had somehow repaired damage that exceeded structural limits. The only explanation was repair capability far beyond what Japanese naval architecture considered possible. By April 1945, with American forces preparing for the invasion of Japan, floating dry docks had been positioned at Okinawa and Guam within 500 m of Japanese home waters. The Americans could now repair battle-damaged vessels within days of major fleet actions, while Japanese vessels damaged in the same actions faced weeks-long journeys to shipyards that were themselves under aerial bombardment. The strategic asymmetry was insuperable. Admiral Sumo Toyota, final commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, acknowledged in his post-war interrogation, the American floating dry docks represented a capability we could not match. They could repair significant battle damage at forward bases while our vessels required return to home waters. By 1945, even our home shipyards were being destroyed by American bombing. We lost the logistics war before we lost the tactical war. The floating dry docks achieved their strategic impact through unglamorous industrial capability rather than dramatic combat action. They never sank enemy vessels. They never participated in fleet actions. They were never mentioned in war communiques or celebrated in American media. But they fundamentally altered the mathematics of Pacific naval warfare. They transformed battle damage from a months-long operational loss to a weeks-long temporary absence. They enabled American carriers to sustain higher operational tempo because damage no longer meant extended absence from combat. They multiplied American naval power by reducing the time vessels spent in repair rather than combat. Japanese admirals who had mocked the floating dry docks as engineering fantasies eventually understood what they represented. Not fantasy, but industrial. Pragmatism, not desperation, but revolutionary logistics thinking. Not weakness, but the confident strength of a nation that could solve complex engineering problems through mass production and modular design. The advanced base sectional docks cost approximately $5 million each to construct, less than 1/10 the cost of a permanent shore dry dock facility. They could be assembled in 6 to 10 weeks, rather than the 2 to 3 years required for permanent installations. They could be relocated as operations shifted, following the fleet rather than requiring the fleet to return to fixed locations. By traditional naval architecture standards, they were compromises. They lacked the sophisticated equipment of permanent shipyards. They operated in open harbors, subject to weather rather than protected basins. They required vessels to remain at forward bases rather than returning to secure rear areas. But in actual warfare, these limitations proved irrelevant compared to the advantages. Speed of repair mattered more than perfection of facilities. Proximity to combat operations mattered more than security of location. Transportability mattered more than permanent optimization. In September 1945, after Japan's surrender, American floating dry docks at Okinawa and Yokosuka began repairing damaged Japanese vessels for repatriation operations. Japanese engineers examining the American facilities finally understood what their intelligence reports had failed to convey: the sophistication of engineering that made the docks functional, the quality of equipment that enabled rapid repairs, the organizational systems that coordinated complex work without permanent shore